From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. Before the break, Kim raised the question of what the no labels platform would be. And I think that's a very good question. If you're going to nominate a no labels candidate to stand up on the debate stage between Joe Biden and Donald Trump, what is that person supposed to say? And I take their point that I think Americans believe that we're more divided in politics than we are in real life. And maybe they have one issue where they can point to where there's some agreement among the public that is not being reflected in the political system right now. And I think that is probably immigration. On one side of the aisle, you have a party who won't stand for any sort of real border security bill. On the other hand, you have another party who won't do any sort of legalization of people who've been here, dreamers. And I think the public, if you paired those together, would support that kind of legislation. Polls suggest that, and it's not coming out of Congress because of the political incentives within each party. But Benet, some of the division in the country also reflects division on the issues, and those are real divisions. And I have a hard time imagining how no labels intends to bridge those. I mean, if you have one party that wants higher taxes and one party that wants lower taxes, what is the no labels stance? That the taxes will stay the same in our administration? Or what about even more divisive things like abortion? If the candidates that the no labels picks take any position on that at all, I think you're going to see those numbers of voters who are open to considering that option fall pretty quickly.
Right. I think that's one of the difficulties of any third-party approach, and one of the reasons why we haven't seen very many successful third-party campaigns in the past, because the U.S. electorate tends to coalesce around two poles. People tend to be more moderate than the politicians they elect in either party, and often are open to compromise in theory. But when you look at the actual positions they take on issues, they tend to prefer one direction or the other direction rather than a mushy middle. And so from the perspective of no labels, I think it does make sense that immigration is one of the issues that they said that they would like to make a central issue in their campaign. And that's because right now, the immigration system in the U.S. is broken in ways that are apparent to just about everybody. And it does seem as if both sides of the aisle have a clear ask that theoretically could set the table for a compromise. So conservatives would like to see the border secured. Obviously, President Biden has been very unwilling and very unable to accomplish that, whereas Democrats want to see a pathway to citizenship for immigrants who are already in this country illegally, particularly the Dreamers, children who are brought to the United States illegally, who then have grown up in this country. And so it does seem as if there's quite a lot to work with, and you could have a candidate who is able to gain a lot of traction with voters by saying we're going to combine these two elements into a grand immigration compromise that Democrats and Republicans haven't been able to secure. Another issue that they think is ripe for compromise is long-term budget problems, particularly solvency for Social Security, Medicaid, et cetera. This is something that obviously is an extremely urgent problem, and becoming more so as the years pass. These programs are gravely underfunded and are claiming a bigger and bigger share of the U.S. budget. But I think that politically it's very difficult because voters have shown that they're very scared of any proposal to reform these two programs. And so even though it is something that draws support from both sides of the aisle, technically, you do see a lot of moderate politicians who are in favor of a compromise on entitlement reform. I could easily imagine a no-labels candidate saying they want to do that, and then both the Democrat and Republican candidates attacking them as wanting to throw Granny off a cliff or whatever the old lines that are usually trotted out against entitlement reform are. But with regard to all the other issues, as you said, I do think you see big disagreements on abortion, big disagreements on taxes and other fiscal issues. And even if a no-labels candidate comes out and says, I want to split the middle on something like abortion, you're going to see them harshly attacked by both sides. And I think particularly by Democrats on abortion, even if no labels said we're in favor of, say, a 15-week ban, or looked at what is the focus group approved place to set that limit on abortion at a federal level. What we've seen is that there's a progressive base which is unwilling to endorse any restrictions, and they would come out and say that no labels was catering to Republican extremists. And so I think except for a very narrow set of issues that happen to be conducive to compromise, they're going to have a very hard time pleasing anyone if they try to take a down the middle of the road approach on these very divisive issues.
Kim, the other interesting thing about this question about whether no labels would be a spoiler is you've had some members of no labels suggest that if the polling suggests that that's what's going to happen, they will pull out. They will hit the self-destruct button and they will end the candidacy before November so that that doesn't happen. I am skeptical of that for a couple of reasons. One of them is that it's kind of a chicken and egg problem. The No Labels group intends to have a convention in Texas to unveil a presidential candidate if they get that far down the road. And there's no way to know how that person is going to poll before that person is announced and is out campaigning, is participating in debates. And then is that person really going to want to pull the plug after coming out as the No Labels presidential candidate and getting flown all around the country? I think that person would be pretty hesitant to end their candidacy instead of running through the tape in November. And by the way, how do we even know that we have confidence in the polling of this at such a detailed level that we could figure out months before the November voting happens that, oh yeah, it looks like our guy is going to take X percentage from one of the two main party candidates and end up as a spoiler? It's a heavy lift, it seems to me.
Right. They've kind of been all over the place in terms of what their commitment is on this. Some suggestion would be that if it looks like they'd be a spoiler, they'd get out. In other situations, they instead suggested that they would only get out if it was clear that either Donald Trump or Joe Biden was not going to be running, that you weren't going to have a rematch. In some cases, the suggestion that they'd simply get out if Donald Trump weren't on the ballot again. We don't really know what their litmus test is. But my experience in politics is that once you have an organization that is pouring tons of money into an initiative, it's a freight train that becomes very difficult to stop. And while we do not know all of the donors, in fact, many of the donors to this group, we do know that it has the intention of spending something like $70 million to get itself on ballots in their hopes in all 50 states. And presumably they intend to raise even more to support what would then be candidates that they chose. And then, as you mentioned, after all of that effort at getting on the ballot and finding the person, is that person just going to want to throw in the towel as well when they have an opportunity to get a lot of attention or potentially even be president, as far-fetched as that might be? So I think that if they commit themselves to this, that people should assume that there's going to be a lot of pressure for them to keep it going. One more thing I would just point out about this group, which I do think is a valid point that some of the critics make about this, which is that because of the way this organization is structured, it doesn't have to say who its donors are. And this is in very big opposition to anyone else who is a declared candidate for the presidency. They're very strict about campaign finance rules, people understanding where they're getting their support, who's giving the dollars. This is a very unusual situation where you have an organization that's essentially claiming a spot for an unnamed person, potentially on many states across the union. We have no idea who's behind it. And that is in contravention to a lot of the other rules we have about doing presidential campaigns.
Monet, we'll give you the last word, but my last thought here is that because of all the complications we've been discussing, this still looks to me like it's a best attempt at changing the argument within the parties as they consider who they want to nominate for president. And notable that Democrats seem the most worried about this, that No Labels candidacy would take votes from Joe Biden and cost him re-election. But they don't seem worried enough yet that they are having second thoughts about why this movement is beginning, why there is such a demand for it, why President Biden's polls are where they are, and whether they should really consider somebody else.
Right. I think that is an optimistic way to look at the role that No Labels could play in the election, affecting the ways that the parties choose to nominate their candidates and putting pressure on them to reconsider renominating Donald Trump and Joe Biden, who are both deeply unpopular with U.S. voters. But I do think that for different reasons, it's unlikely that No Labels will actually be able to have that effect. I do think that among Republicans, it is likely that Donald Trump has a strong core of voters who will support him just about no matter what. We've seen that over the past months as his poll numbers have increased, despite the fact that he's gone through all sorts of legal troubles. And it seems as if there are obviously Republican alternative candidates who are mounting campaigns and trying to see if they can damage Donald Trump and find ways to appeal to more voters and gain the nomination. But it just doesn't seem to me as if the possibility of a moderate third-party candidate is really going to play into that dynamic between Trump and all the alternatives. And for Democrats, it does seem as if there's a growing awareness of Joe Biden's unpopularity. And if the possibility of a more moderate third-party option were to loom, it would be very rational to say, hey, this is even more reason for us to open up the floor to competitors and see if we can put a better, more appealing candidate on the Democratic Party ticket. But I just think President Biden, having already served a term, is in a very well-established position, and that the potential rivals think that they have too much to lose as long as he says that he wants to run again. And so we'll see if No Labels continues to gain visibility and steam, and if they nominate someone, if that does affect the primaries. But I would be very skeptical to say that that's a likely outcome as of now.
Thank you, Monet and Kim. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button, and we'll be back tomorrow with another edition of Potomac Watch.